The United States is often called a Christian country. The nation, however, has always been home to individuals indifferent to, or opposed to, organized religions. These unbelievers were known as agnostics, atheists, deists, infidels, liberals, and freethinkers.
The freethinkers, generally speaking, were people who inquired freely, who asked penetrating questions about everything, including religion, and followed their own logic, their own deduction, their own line of inquiry, and were willing to disbelieve orthodox religious tenets of the time if their reason was convinced that those tenets were not legitimate. There's a great deal about what has made America what it is today that's very difficult to understand if you don't understand the role that the freethinkers played.
In the 19th century, free thinkers, inspired by Thomas Paine, united in their unbelief.
Tom Paine once wrote, "My religion is to do good, to do good." And to do good for him meant the expansion of liberty and rights for all people.
Free thinkers embraced new scientific discoveries and championed science and reason over religion.
For the defense and the infidels, Clarence Darrow.
Origin and Darwin's theory of evolution changed everything. I think it changed the social, the intellectual, and the moral landscape. It was difficult to view the world in the same way after that.
In the land of liberty, however, the belief in science and reason instead of dogmatic religion was an unpopular cause. Freethinkers, who fought for separation of church and state, faced prosecution for violating puritanical blasphemy and obscenity laws, and found themselves unwelcome in what some considered the one nation under God.
Blasphemy laws were on the books in numberless cities across the United States.
It's interesting that in the 19th century, the First Amendment was really seen as protecting the states from the federal government. Only later did it receive the interpretation that we now have of it as protecting the right of free expression.
It took courage to speak out in a country that was deeply religious. There were a lot of different religions, but the overwhelming majority were Protestants.
The abolitionists and freethinkers were definitely courageous people. They had to fight mobs. Members of the public would attend their conventions just to harass them, to throw tomatoes, to catcall, to physically threaten them.
When we look back at the 19th century freethinkers, what really stands out is they were such courageous people. You could lose your job, you could be shunned by your family, you could be frozen out of society. These people were taking big risks in support of their ideals, in the defense of the truth as they saw it.
They rebelled against the realities of the day, the beliefs of the day that had been handed down to them.
They took stands in which they were maligned, they were harassed. It was extraordinary. So extraordinarily courageous people. The free thought movement is something that needs to be better known in America.
In North America, long before the founding of the United States, European colonists argued about the role religion should play in political and public life. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson certainly read the Christian Bible. Once, he even revised it. but he was profoundly influenced by the works of classical Greek and Roman moral philosophers who predated the Christian era. Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers avidly read the great philosophers of the European Enlightenment, who believed in rationalism and science. One of the primary concepts of the Enlightenment was to give every idea and assumption the test of reason. When well-read and worldly men like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin applied reason to Christianity or any revealed religion and removed revelation, they ended up with deism, a belief in God based on nature, a natural religion, as opposed to revealed religion like Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson invoked the laws of nature and nature's God, a phrase without any Christian connotation. Thomas Jefferson's God, the God of deism, spoke to men and women through nature and not through biblical revelation. In the Declaration's litany of complaints against the English monarchy, there's not a single mention of religion. And while Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence are called American scripture, his phrase, "the wall of separation of church and state," in the letter to the Danbury Baptists, is the source of the centuries-old debate between those who see America as a secular republic or those who view it as a Christian nation. Religion was a personal matter for the nation's third president, who declared that he was in a sect by himself.
Say nothing of my religion. It is known to my God and myself alone. Thomas Jefferson.
The founders had clear historical memories of the religious warfare that had racked Europe. And they wanted to keep church and state separate, not just for the benefit of the church, but also for the benefit of the state, because they understood how hugely destructive it could be for religious disputes to erupt onto the public square.
Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were both condemned as atheists and infidels for their sympathy for the French Revolution and their dislike for organized religions.
Thomas Paine, of course, was the author of one of the first American bestsellers, Common Sense, which played an important, pivotal role in rallying the American public behind the revolution. Everybody could agree with the arguments in Common Sense, but the Age of Reason was a much more challenging work for a country that was as religious as this country.
True believers thought that Tom Paine's Age of Reason was heresy. They thought he was an atheist. They wanted to burn the books. He was basically ostracized.
Since settlers first came to the New World, the great American experiment has been riddled with profound contradictions. Puritans came seeking religious freedom and immediately persecuted Native Americans and denied other settlers the same religious liberty. Americans boasted about their freedom and equal rights for all citizens, but tolerated slavery until the Civil War and denied women the right to vote until 1920.
Susan B. Anthony and her followers have won for women the right to vote.
Radical abolitionists in the late 1830s and 1840s viewed churches as part of the problem rather than as part of the solution.
The women's rights movement begins with the effort to speak against those ministers attempting to silence women speaking out against slavery. The women's rights movement begins at that moment in the abolitionist movement.
On several occasions, powerful religious organizations and politicians have attempted to put God, particularly Jesus Christ, into the Constitution.
They knew they couldn't establish an official religion for the United States. They were of many different Protestant denominations, but they thought that the solution was to inscribe God and Jesus into the Constitution as the supreme authority. And so they proposed an amendment to the Constitution. Then there was the whole liberal, more secular side of the society that saw this effort to re-Christianize America after the Civil War. as disturbing and something to be resisted.
During the golden age of free thought, it's estimated that about a 1/12 of the American public either were freethinkers or were sympathetic to free thought. This was a fairly loose and sometimes very fractious group of people, but they did have one national organization, and this was the National Liberal League.
The National Liberal League was really a pioneering institution, bringing together in a structured form the secular movement in the United States. And in effect, it was to bring about complete separation of church and state.
If you forget your history, you're never going to know where you came from. And a big part of where modern-day America came from is the free thought movement, the conservative Christian initiatives that it opposed, and the conflict between them, and the law and precedent that spun off from those conflicts.
The first shot fired at religion in America came from the pen of Revolutionary War hero Ethan Allen. After the war in 1784, Allen published, at his own expense, Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, the first book printed in America in direct opposition to the Christian religion. Ethan Allen's deistical polemic enraged the clergy, and he predicted that preachers and their devotees would proclaim war on him in the name of the Lord and produce some of their tremendous fire. And a fire there was, in the publisher's print shop, destroying nearly all 1,500 books printed. Scarcely any copies of Allen's heretical book have survived. And while Ethan Allen was memorialized in stone after his death, one prominent clergyman condemned the hero as an ignorant and profane deist who died with a mind replete with horror and despair. It would, however, be Ethan Allen's fellow patriot and deist, Thomas Paine, who, armed only with his pen, made clergymen fear for their faith and livelihood more than anyone before or since. Born in Thetford, England, on January 29, 1737, Thomas Paine was raised in a mixed religion home. Though his early religious training was minimal, he acquired the ability to recite long biblical passages, which he did throughout his life.
He was actually brought up in the Anglican tradition until his father's Quaker religion began to be much more influential on him. He gradually became a deist, which means that you might believe in a higher being, a supreme being who created the universe and everything in it, but after that it's up to us to make it better or worse.
At 19, Thomas Paine ran away to sea and served on board a privateer. After returning to England, he worked at a series of occupations and grew fond of books, debating, and politics. While employed as a tax collector in Lewis, he wrote a petition to Parliament on behalf of his fellow taxmen for more pay and better working conditions. In London, Paine was introduced to Benjamin Franklin, who advised him to come to America.
Thomas Paine's main influence was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was the colonial agent for Pennsylvania, living in London for many, many years. And just before Franklin's return, Paine met him, almost fortuitously, and he asked for a letter of introduction because he wanted to leave England and try his luck in America.
In 1774, Thomas Paine arrived penniless in Philadelphia, with only his pen and Franklin's letter of recommendation. One of Paine's first articles was a denunciation of slavery, published in early 1775. Paine called slave traders and slaveholders men stealers.
Our traders in men, an unnatural commodity, must know the wickedness of the slave trade, if they attend to reasoning or the dictates of their own hearts, and such as shun and stifle all these willfully sacrifice conscience and the character of integrity to that golden idol, Thomas Paine.
A few weeks after Paine's slavery essay, the first anti-slavery society in America was established in Philadelphia. As editor of Pennsylvania Magazine, he wrote poetry and essays against aristocratic titles, dueling, cruelty to animals, and in support of his fellow Quakers.
He really saw divinity in everything on this earth. In every human being, no matter how evil or bad they were, there was some good in them. And no matter how rotten things looked in a city or a town or whatever, there was some good in it, and that he tried to find what that was and help develop it.
While Benjamin Franklin recognized Paine's passion and talent, he could not have known that the 37-year-old would become the most brilliant political polemicist and iconoclastic writer in the English-speaking world. Franklin referred to Paine as his political adopted son and took pride in his role as the Englishman's New World patron. They remained friends until Franklin's death in 1790.
I value myself on the share I had in procuring for America the acquisition of so useful and valuable a citizen. Benjamin Franklin.
Less than 2 years after arriving in America, Paine published Common Sense, a pamphlet so powerful and popular, it united the American colonies and set the tone for the Declaration of Independence 6 months later.
Thomas Paine only had 6 formal years of education, and he had no university training, so he wasn't really trained to be a writer. Thomas Paine wrote in a very plain style that was accessible to the common man. That is, someone who had very little education or no education at all. Someone who read his work would be immediately taken by it because it was explicit what he was saying. He used images and metaphors that anybody could understand.
Thomas Paine's follow-up work, The American Crisis, fortified George Washington's army during the darkest hours of the Revolutionary War. His Rights of Man, later authored in England, outsold Common Sense and has been called the best-selling book in the history of publishing.
Tom Paine never made any money on his publications. He turned all of his money over, all his royalties, as we would call them today, on Common Sense to the American cause. He could have made a lot of money for Common Sense. It was a 18th century bestseller. Rights of Man, when it came out in 1791, was another bestseller. He never made any money on his publications, and he could have. Any author today would be envious of the sales that he had.
The world is my country, all mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion.
He was a man of thought, but he was also a man of action. He was not an armchair radical, as some people could be, and there's nothing wrong with being that and simply writing about things. But he actually took action. He was involved in the American Revolution. He was involved in the French Revolution.
After the American Revolution, Thomas Paine traveled to Europe and lived in France during the French Revolution.
He was actually elected as a deputy to the French National Convention to write a new Republican Constitution for France. Unfortunately for him and for many others, however, the more radical movement of the French Revolution, led by Robespierre and Saint-Just and a whole bunch of other French radicals, took over the convention in July of 1793 and arrested all of the so-called moderates. And Paine was considered a moderate. He was not arrested immediately. He was arrested that December in 1793. He was accused, of all things, of being a British spy. And off he went to the Luxembourg prison for the next 11 months.
As Paine was being taken to prison, he handed the manuscript for his book, The Age of Reason, over to Joel Barlow, the American poet and diplomat, who drafted the Treaty of Tripoli. While imprisoned and facing the guillotine, Paine continued writing the second part of Age of Reason. Though gravely ill, he was denied freedom because Gouverneur Morris, America's minister, refused to recognize Paine's American citizenship. An elitist who believed in aristocracy Morris vehemently disagreed with Paine's political philosophy and abhorred his views on organized religions.
Lest I should forget it, I must mention that Thomas Paine is in prison, where he amuses himself with publishing a pamphlet against Jesus Christ. Gouverneur Morris.
Thomas Paine says that many people who were in prison during the Reign of Terror were beheaded. He reports that what happens to people is that their cell door has an X placed on it. If the X is on your door, you're taken out at night, and the next morning you're beheaded. He said, unfortunately for the jailers, they wrote the X on the inside of the door. It was only that pure reason that he escaped execution. But he claims that he saw his death warrant that was signed by Robespierre himself.
In November 1794, after narrowly avoiding death by execution and suffering from a serious abscess on his side, Paine was finally released from the Luxembourg prison with the help of future President James Monroe, who had replaced Gouverneur Morris as minister to France. While recuperating at the Monroe residence in Paris, Paine finished writing The Age of Reason.
Tom Paine's Age of Reason was one of his last works. It came out in two parts in 1793 and 94. He had long thought about writing about religion. It was something that was very, very important to him. One of the things he learned early on, though, was that organized religion was like organized government. It could be corrupt and it could be oppressive.
Whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God. It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind. And for my own part, I sincerely detest it, as I detest everything that is cruel. Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason.
He did not believe in anything that was in the Bible. He thought it was that the so-called miracles of the Bible were based on superstition and fiction and had corrupted men's minds just as much as monarchy and aristocracy did. The Age of Reason was his corrective to that. It was his way to say that all of that is bunk, and the only religion that we really have is based on creation. That God had created the universe and man to be in it, and left him with free will to either mess it up or make it better.
The Age of Reason was a bestseller in America, reprinted 18 times in the first 2 years after publication. Thomas Paine was a deist who believed in one God, but thought organized religions, all of them, were inventions built to enslave mankind.
I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish Church, by the Roman Church, by the Greek Church, by the Turkish Church, by the Protestant Church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church. All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions, set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit.
In 1802, Thomas Paine returned home to America and was honored as a hero in New York. He campaigned for Thomas Jefferson and resumed writing on economics, politics, and religion. And he responded to his Christian critics and Federalist foes.
When he returned to the United States, he had a lot of trouble because of his position taken in the Age of Reason. That basically undermined his reputation in America.
Founding Father and President John Adams and other leading Federalists who supported a more powerful central government were among Paine's influential enemies. These terrorists of the New World, as Paine called them, echoed the lies first printed to discredit his democratic radicalism.
Government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. Its worst state, an intolerable one. Thomas Paine, common sense.
Not only did Christian periodicals and Federalist papers constantly excoriate the author hero, but the mainstream press also piled on Paine. In 1802, a popular Hudson, New York weekly commented on Thomas Jefferson's invitation to Paine to visit the White House.
He has invited the most foul and virulent blasphemer, whose writings have overspread the land like a moral pestilence and have unhinged the principles, corrupted the hearts, and blasted the hopes of thousands of American youth.
In a brief letter to Paine, firebrand revolutionary Samuel Adams thanked him for his service to the American cause. But after hearing about the Age of Reason and newspaper accounts of Paine's intention to unchristianize America's citizens, the church deacon condemned Paine for defending infidelity. Paine was astonished by his compatriots' criticism and responded in a cordial letter to his dear friend, whom he suspected never read the Age of Reason. Paine explained that he wrote the book as an antidote to violence, and that during the Reign of Terror he endangered his life twice by opposing atheism and the execution of the King of France. And as he had done several times in The Age of Reason, in his letter to Adams, Paine affirmed his belief in God and universal benevolence. But about the deity, he declared,
"He needs no service from us. We can add nothing to eternity, but it is in our power to render a service acceptable to Him. And that is not by praying, but by endeavoring to make His creatures happy."
Religionists dubbed Paine the agent of Lucifer. Articles published in opposition to Paine's theological opinions often marginalized his contribution to America and damned his political principles.
Thomas Paine actually had good relations with some clergymen. He did not really have a break with the clergy until the Age of Reason in 1793-94, which they appeared during the time that he was in the Luxembourg prison and then just getting out of prison. Afterwards, they began to try to downplay his influence on the American Revolution and his participation in the French Revolution. Some would have liked to have obliterated his memory completely because of the heresy that they saw in the book, The Age of Reason.
Revisionist writers reported that during the War for Independence, Paine cautiously avoided scenes of danger, and in the annals of the Revolution, his name was enrolled in the list of cowards.
He was an advisor both to General Washington, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, but also General Nathaniel Greene, who was almost the second in command to Washington. So he was very important, but he spent most of the years writing what he called the American Crisis Papers, to rally the American patriots to continue the very, very rough battle against the greatest army and navy in the world, the British Imperial Army and Navy.
The great American cause owed as much to the pen of Paine as the sword of Washington.
Newspapers continued to vilify Thomas Paine as a viperous creature, a lying, drunken, brutal infidel who subjected his second wife to repeated beatings. Paine was portrayed in print as an immoral villain with his perennial bottle of brandy, living in sin with his mistress, unkempt and spewing obscene language.
When, for example, that period from the beginning of the Reign of Terror in the middle of the summer of 1793 until his arrest in December of 93, I think he probably drank more than normal for himself because he was upset by what was happening. But beyond that, I don't think he was a drinker more than anybody else of the time.
In 1806, Thomas Paine faced the ultimate insult when he was denied the right to vote near his New Rochelle farm, the farm he had been awarded by the New York State Legislature for his services to the revolutionary cause. Federalist election supervisors determined that Paine was not an American citizen because neither Gouverneur Morris nor George Washington had reclaimed him while he was in the Luxembourg prison. Morris, a Federalist and founding father, considered Paine a blasphemer and too radical to be an American citizen.
He came to America in 1774. That was before there was a United States, so it was still the colonies. So he was still regarded as a British citizen. So citizenship in terms of being an American was really something that was post-1789 when the first federal government was created. He took allegiance to the United States. He considered himself American. He identified as American. The end of Thomas Paine's life was a sad ending. He had very few friends. People thought he was an atheist.
Thomas Paine died on June 8, 1809, in Greenwich Village, New York City. His final wish was to be buried in a Quaker cemetery with a modest headstone inscribed, Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense.
The Quakers refused. I think they refused for a number of reasons. One, because he really had given up on them and had fought in the American Revolution. But they also feared that those who admired him would want to place a statue on his grave. And that is something that is prohibited in the Society of Friends. It's just the inner light of the human being that's important, nothing else.
I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy.
Writing about liberty and human rights was his life's goal, not just for himself, not just for the Americans, but for people throughout the world. And he wrote about that as being almost a religion, and that's why I characterize him as being an apostle of freedom.
Only a handful of personal friends, none of his revolutionary compatriots, nor a single founding father attended Thomas Paine's burial in New Rochelle. Soon after his death, clergymen claimed Thomas Paine recanted on his deathbed, repudiated his Age of Reason, and admitted that the Holy Scriptures were the Word of God.
The story of Thomas Paine's recanting at his death is not true. It's a story that's spread by his religious enemies, the people who hated the book. They wanted to show that at the end he really had a change of heart and was a Christian in a very traditional sense. That never happened. He was a deist until the end of his life, and that really is the end of it.
The end of Thomas Paine's life, however, did not end the controversy. The easy availability and popularity of Paine's Bible critique concerned clergymen. It especially infuriated prominent Presbyterian layman Elias Boudinot, former president of the Continental Congress. Prior to Thomas Paine's death, the pious 60-year-old director of the United States Mint published his first book, The Age of Revelation, a Bible-based condemnation of Paine's Age of Reason. In his book, Boudinot, an old Federalist friend of George Washington, impugned Thomas Paine's sobriety, integrity, and moral conduct. The wealthy landowner expressed shock that the Age of Reason was sold inexpensively in Philadelphia and available to children, servants, and in his words, the lowest people. Elias Boudinot decided to devote the rest of his life and fortune to building an opposing organization dedicated to what he considered a more worthy purpose. In 1809, the year of Thomas Paine's death, Boudinot's labors led to the formation of the New Jersey Bible Society. 7 years later, Boudinot founded the American Bible Society. Elias Boudinot and other prominent Christian laymen were fascinated by the potential of converting the expanding frontier. The celebrated Protestant minister, Lyman Beecher, prophesied that if the West was won, the millennium would commence in America. But he warned, an unchristianized frontier would harbor a poor, uneducated mass of infuriated animalism.
The fear was that these frontiersmen would become unchurched. They would become pagans in a sense. They would revert to a type of animalism, as the Reverend Beecher put it at the time.
Beecher, Boudinot, and other leading divines were on a spiritual mission to save souls. They began to dream of mass communication with the goal to place printed religious material into the hands of everyone in America. One of the earliest and most successful religious publishing organizations was the American Tract Society, founded in 1825. The Tract Society paid individuals like Elizur Wright $150 per year to distribute religious material to pioneers living on the edge of society, far from church and clergy.
He had really been socialized by his parents as the eldest male son in a large family to become the standard bearer of the family, and they expected him to be a minister.
Protestant publishers were enraptured with modern printing technology and believed in the moral power of the press. After all, wasn't God himself a printer who handed his laws to Moses engraved in stone tablets? For religious organizations like the American Tract Society, the steam press was more than a tool. It was a gift from God. From their headquarters in New York City, the American Tract Society distributed their evangelical works across the nation. 65 million tracts were distributed in the Tract Society's first 6 years.
So these tracts by the American Tract Society were particularly designed to reach out not only to the burgeoning urban areas in the Northeast, but into places like Western Pennsylvania, then in the early 19th century, still quite wild and unsettled, without many churches, without many formal religious institutions. So as a young man just out of Yale College, still ostensibly hoping to become a minister, this was a means by which he could fulfill his effort to do the right thing as an evangelical, to spread the word of God as he saw it then, with these little tracts which told about amazing redemptions, people who were on their deathbed, who had scoffed at religion, who finally found God and died in solace. Wright starts to express skepticism to the elders of the Presbyterian Church, so they denied him a license to preach because some of his answers were not orthodox enough. And that really starts to begin his path towards unbelief and free thought. It's a gradual evolution. It's a change over time, but that is definitely a mark.
Although groomed for the ministry, Elizur Wright accepted a professorship of mathematics and natural philosophy at Western Reserve College in Hudson, Ohio. During this time, Wright, along with a few of his colleagues, started receiving copies of The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper, from Boston.
The reason this is such an important transition, not only in Wright's life, but in American history, and particularly protest history, is that Garrison, a very vehement, vociferous, powerful truth seeker, made this point, borrowing from Walker and other African-American critics, is that slavery is the greatest sin there is. And the churches, if they're concerned with sin, must denounce slavery. And they must do it emphatically and call for immediate abolition. But of course, none of the established churches, especially the Protestant churches, except for a few fringe Quaker groups, took a stand against slavery.
Another 19th century immediatist abolitionist who found fault with the church's role in slavery was Lucretia Mott, who, like Thomas Paine, was a Quaker.
Lucretia Mott's not dissimilar from Paine in that both were Quakers, both were anti-clerical, both viewed organized religion as profoundly problematic, and both were interested in individual liberty. Lucretia Mott was a heretic in that she held very controversial, unorthodox beliefs that brought her into conflict with her co-religionists in the Society of Friends.
We often bind ourselves by authorities rather than by the truth. Lucretia Mott.
Lucretia Mott saw American churches as one of the bulwarks of slavery. She believed that no religion was taking an adequate stand against slavery. Lucretia Mott was an immediate abolitionist. She believed that slavery should be ended without question, without compensation, not gradually, immediately. And this made her one of a radical minority in American society in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s. Churches won't host anti-slavery speakers. They will shut their doors to anti-slavery speakers. And abolitionists at one point have to build their own hall, Pennsylvania Hall, which is opened in 1838 in Philadelphia, and immediately, in its first week of opening, is burned to the ground by a mob of 15,000 strong. So the abolitionists see the church as an obstacle to ending slavery. They see them as unwilling to condemn the institution, unwilling to excommunicate slaveholders, or even tell them that what they are doing is sinning.
At Western Reserve, Elizur Wright and his colleagues, convinced by the passionate arguments of William Lloyd Garrison, transformed the college into a center for radical abolitionism and demanded immediate emancipation and equal rights for blacks. Like many other 19th century immediatist abolitionists, Wright was taught the ethic of doing the right thing. But after learning from William Lloyd Garrison that his Christian religion ignored and/or even supported slavery, he turned against the church because of its hypocrisy.
So these young people in their 20s and 30s, reared in the church, taught to do the right thing, revered in the teachings of what we might call the social gospel, to find out that the organized church would not only not take a stand against slavery, but actually would denounce the abolitionists, led many of them, like Wright, to break with the church and to denounce the church as hypocritical. And that is the central aspect of what Garrison did for many abolitionists.
In 1833, Elizur Wright accepted the position of Secretary of Domestic Correspondence of the American Anti-Slavery Society in New York City, which placed him in the vanguard of the movement. Wright exhibited organizational and literary talents, aided fugitive slaves, and argued passionately for racial justice.
Christ was a radical. See his Sermon on the Mount. So were his apostles. Elizur Wright.
Wright's annual reports to the National Anti-Slavery Society included a litany of crimes against abolitionists: whipping, imprisonment, Garrison being mobbed in Boston, and the murder of Illinois anti-slavery printer Elijah Lovejoy.
His press was repeatedly attacked by mobs. And finally, the third or fourth attack on his printing press, the mob killed him. And he was a very important figure for the anti-slavery movement ever after, because he represented the censoring tendencies of pro-slavery forces, their willingness to shut down free speech and shut down any opinion that they didn't agree with.
Georgia Governor Wilson Lumpkin responded to Yankee anti-slavery activity by offering a $5,000 bounty for the delivery of 10 leading abolitionists, including Elizur Wright.
It is slavery and not the Constitution which governs the United States at the present time.
Elizur soldiered on, and by 1840, factionalism among abolitionists found Wright in the forefront of political action in Boston, where he edited abolitionist newspapers. The backlash against abolitionism provoked Wright to denounce Christian hypocrisy and attack prominent clergymen in print, including his one-time idol, Lyman Beecher.
Our revered doctors of divinity in one breath preach from the Bible that it's a mortal sin to steal a pin, and in the next appeal to the same Bible to show that stealing a man or woman is no sin at all.
In Wright's case, he took a stand against slavery at a time in which this vocal group of principled people were attacked, in some cases killed, imprisoned, intimidated.
In the turbulent decades ahead, both Lucretia Mott and Elizur Wright would participate in other reform movements. Lucretia Mott would play a prominent role in the women's rights movement. Elizur Wright would fight for free speech and become one of the nation's most remarkable reformers and a revered leader in the American Freethought movement. In 1819, a decade after his death, Thomas Paine's bones were robbed from his grave in New Rochelle and spirited away to England, where they disappeared. Freethinkers, however, never lost sight of Thomas Paine's contribution to America and the Freethought movement.
In terms of maintaining Thomas Paine's memory, it is the truth seeker that has done that, but also the Thomas Paine societies that exist in the United States and in Britain, and there's some that are actually in France too. It's a particular group of people who always saw Paine as being part of the long-established ideal of liberty and human rights that kept his memory alive and continue today.
Liberty means not the mere voting at elections, but the free and fearless exercise of the mental faculties, and that self-possession which springs out of well-reasoned opinions and consistent practice. Francis Wright.
In the 1820s and 1830s, Freethought activist Francis Wright and other Painites, as they were known, began hosting annual birthday commemorations on January 29th. In the early 19th century, however, speaking in public was not an acceptable activity for females, and Wright became one of the most despised women in America.
Frances Wright was probably the first woman of any persuasion to create an independent name for herself as a public speaker in the United States. She was an outspoken freethinker. She was for the abolition of slavery. She was involved in bold projects to repatriate freed slaves and build colonies for them and all these sorts of things.
The hired preachers of all sects, creeds, and religions never do and never can teach anything but what is in conformity with the opinions of those who pay them.
Scottish-born Francis Wright operated a liberal bookstore in Manhattan, recommended turning churches into halls of science, and published one of the first Freethought periodicals in America, the Free Inquirer.
It had created the genre of the Freethought paper, and it created the conventions that later papers like the Index and the Truth Seeker would follow in terms of the sorts of stories they ran. It was hugely influential in that sense.
British-born Gilbert Vale, an early biographer of Thomas Paine, raised funds through the columns of his Beacon publication to build the Paine Monument in New Rochelle. The 1839 dedication of the monument was the first of many Memorial Day celebrations held near the Paine cottage and monument. Francis Wright and Gilbert Vale would be the first in a long line of liberal publishers who promoted the author hero in the pages of their Freethought periodicals. Beginning in 1873, the Truth Seeker would pick up the torch and continue to champion and defend Thomas Paine. American freethinkers always revered Thomas Paine. In the last decade of the 19th century, however, when mainstream historians were finally beginning to recognize his contribution to the country and restore his memory, Paine's reputation was again tarnished by none other than a future president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. In Roosevelt's favorable biography of founding father Gouverneur Morris, he called Paine a filthy little atheist.
Little he never was. I mean, he was not little. He was 5 feet 10 inches. The average size of a man in the 18th century was 5'5" or 5'6". He was no atheist. He never was an atheist. He was a deist. So Teddy Roosevelt was a great writer, and he probably our most literary presidents. He wrote a lot of books and a lot of histories and a lot of his stories about himself, but he got that wrong.
Theodore Roosevelt's reckless remark published in the biography of Morris, ironically, the same statesman who let Thomas Paine languish in prison facing death during the French Revolution, caused indignation among freethinkers. The Truth Seeker publication came to Paine's defense and exposed Teddy Roosevelt's malicious slur, and proved beyond any doubt that the Rough Rider was wrong about Thomas Paine.
I think that 19th and 20th century freethinkers have were attracted to Tom Paine mainly because of the Age of Reason. I think his deism that he expresses in that work is really based on the foundation of free thought. And then from there comes his ideas about human rights and human liberty. That really is what the foundation of free thinking is, that we are individual souls, that we have free will, that we have the ability to improve the world, and we have the intellect and the passion to do it. And he certainly did, and he exemplified it.
In the hearts and minds of free thinkers, Thomas Paine, for lack of a better phrase, is the patron saint of free thought, and, as historians agree, one of America's founding fathers.
I consider Paine the forgotten founding father because he is not listed in the great constellation of stars, so to speak. When you mention Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Adams, and Madison and the rest, Thomas Paine is either an afterthought or a forgotten thought. I would like to see him as a very important part of that generation.
Freedom had been hunted round the globe. Reason was considered as rebellion, and the slavery of fear had made men afraid to think. But such is the irresistible nature of truth, that all it asks and all it wants is the liberty of appearing.